I'd call us good. Thank you. This is a quorum, and as we noted previously in a few different places, we're going to record this session because, like all the other activities that we're doing in this working group, we're talking and learning with each other, but we're also building a information resource in real time for folks who may not be able to make these meetings, but we'll have a place to come to get the information. So today's session is the first of what we're calling our expert sessions. We have two others currently planned, and they'll be in between our regular meetings. I think we can put them up at the end maybe for the specific dates. And so today's session is, focused on this subject of tax increment financing, which, is a really powerful tool that has historical roots. And we have Joe Dieguez from Cosmont Companies, one of the state leaders in the nuanced work of putting these agreements and terms together, working with all the parties that need to be involved. And then we have, of course, Scott Adair from the county of Humboldt, who has been instrumental in putting together the Samoa Peninsula EIFD, which I think is one of the most northern EIFD's information in the state. So it's our format for these expert sessions is really to pair a general subject matter expert with a local practitioner to really help people, draw it down to applications, on the ground in our area. So that's kind of the recipe that we have put together, working with Susan and Amanda. And yeah, so I'd say without too much further ado, unless there's any questions before we get going, if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand. You can also use the chat during. I think that's a fair place to input comments and questions. Sounds like Rick, you might have your mute open. Yeah, feel free to chat with questions. There will be time for questions. We're planning about 25 or 30 minutes of a talking, and then there'll be a little bit of a Q&A period, and then Scott will follow Joe's presentation. After that was still some more Q&A after that. So we do want to have some of that time for discussion. And yeah, I think that's kind of what we have going on here. So I'll pass it over to Joe, and feel free to go further on your introduction, Joe, and all of that. There'll be a slideshow. We'll, of course, share those out later and post them on the website as well. So without further ado, Joe Dieguez, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And thanks, everyone, for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us here. Hope I live up to this label of expert. No pressure, right? But no, I do hope we cover some things that you find relevant and interesting. I do have some slides that I'll walk through, but in prepping for the session, I think we all agree we want to keep it conversational. If you've got kind of a hot button question you want to bring up, don't wait until I'm done either. At least put it in the chat or raise your hand or whatever. Love to keep folks engaged. Again, keep it interesting, keep it useful for you all. So I'll start to get into some things. Just for super quickly on background. So the firm that I work with, Cosmont, does real estate economic development and public finance. About 2/3 of our clients are cities and counties. The remaining third are private sector folks like developers or major employers, some nonprofits. Firm's been around since '86. I've been here 14 years. A lot of what I focus on is figuring out ways to pay for infrastructure. Sometimes it's just public agency alone, figuring out how to pay for some public improvements, capital facilities. Sometimes it's in the context of a public-private transaction where you've got both a private sector entity and a public agency trying to work together and solve a mutual need. Maybe it's some core water, sewer, road to get a project built. Maybe it's some water treatment facilities that serve a much broader area. So lots of different examples we'll cover here. My goal will be to cover some fundamentals. I'll stop short of getting too far into case studies because I think it would be best to start with Scott's case study in Humboldt, which he'll talk about. And then if there is time and interest after Scott talks about Samoa Peninsula, I'm happy to talk in more detail about some other case studies, which I have queued up, if that's what folks want. That's kind of the flow. I'll start high level. The whole world of development finance covers a lot of tools. The subject for today's briefing is just this top bubble in blue, tax increment financing. But we always have to tell people it's not like the holy grail. It's not the panacea that fixes everything that we have to deal with on the public agency side when it comes to paying for infrastructure. It's just one source. Things like grants, impact fee programs, other forms of general fund financing, or CFDs, community facilities district, all those things will always play a role. We're just finding that increasingly so the world of tax increment financing has relevance and can really fill a gap. I know some of this stuff is maybe elementary to some folks in this room. I just really want to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind or talking over anyone's head. So I do want to cover some of the fundamentals, at least briefly. When we talk about tax increment financing, we always have to be very clear. We are not talking about adding a new tax. We're not talking about a CFD or an assessment district or an LLD or a BID or a PBID, nothing that a property owner sees new on their bill. Tax increment financing is really more about, hey, we as a public agency, we're going to designate some boundary within our jurisdiction. And as value grows within that boundary, whether it's from brand new ground up development or from rehab of significantly underutilized property, we're going to see a lot more property tax revenues from this area. And what we want to do is just put a portion of it aside, kind of like a retirement account, put it aside and restrict it for infrastructure. So typically when we do these, we're not talking about all of the growth within the area being encumbered for infrastructure. We always like to reserve some funding to flow unencumbered to the general fund just to facilitate day-to-day operations, public safety, all those things. But usually it's just some portion that's restricted in a separate fund, the so-called EIFD fund, or it could be other forms of TIF, which I'll talk about, but they are restricted for certain purposes. And it's for a prescribed period of time. It's not forever. It could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, some prescribed period of time. And then after that district terminates, everything goes back to normal, so to speak. The property tax flows to everyone like it normally would. So that kind of the fundamentals of tax increment. We're only talking about splitting up the pie of future dollars within a boundary. We have this sort of baseline shown here because when you form it, you're not changing anything about the way, today's the current flow of property tax dollars change. It's very important from a finance director or CFO perspective. We're just talking about apportioning future dollars, again, like that retirement account analogy. So if it sounds familiar, it was the main thrust of the old redevelopment agencies. That was the main juice for that tool. It was property tax increment. Same deal with some nuance that I'll talk about. That's tax increment financing. We're not really just going to talk about EIFDs today. I think we continue to see that be the most widely used tools, but the sort of TIF toolkit in California has continued to grow since the EIFDs were introduced in 2014. So there's a lot of them, and we're not going to go into all of these in detail. There's just no time. And also we would say there's not a great deal of relevance in talking about some of these. The ones that we usually like to spend time on are, yes, EIFDs, the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts. That's what Scott will talk about in Humboldt County. Another one that I like to talk about, especially recently, is new. It's this Climate Resilience District, which I do want to cover in a couple minutes in more detail. So it's only effective since January 1 of 2023. And we think it's going to get a lot of attention. It already is getting a lot of attention for some good reason. And then another one that we'd say deserves some attention is this Community Revitalization and Investment Authority, known as CREA for short. These are all similar in that they have this tax increment financing authority. Some of the differences are things like, an EIFD or the CRD, you can draw the boundaries in a non-contiguous format. You don't have to qualify in any means by any means of income, crime, or unemployment or anything like that. And the dollars, you're not really restricting any portion of the dollars in an affordable housing set aside like you used to have to do with the old redevelopment agencies. Some of those differences you see in this CREA, this one to the far right, where you are first required to do some measure of qualification, again, income, crime, or unemployment, or designation as a disadvantaged community census tract. And then further, you are required to set aside a specific amount of dollars. 25% of the total dollars have to be set aside for affordable housing uses. So it makes sense in some communities, not all, but we're not seeing too much action. We've seen a lot of people sort of studying the CREAs, but not as much implementation, certainly not as much as the EIFD. And these are a district that do have to be contiguous in nature. You can't sort of spread it out across the community. These other ones I'm really not going to give any further attention to because we believe they have just a lot of restrictions that really hinder their sort of realistic implementation. But if there's time later, I'm happy to talk about any of those if folks are interested. I do just want to cover some highlights again. Sorry if this is elementary for some folks who've heard similar presentations or similar material in the past. They're long-term districts, EIFDs, as well as some of these other ones, authorized generally 45, 50 years. They can be shorter if the local agency wants to make them shorter, but that's their maximum duration. Time to form, it's been getting faster and faster as the industry is catching up. And I mean, public agencies, I also mean the attorneys that work on these, the consultants, everyone who works on these. So these days, we're in the neighborhood of maybe 11 or 12 months on the short end to 18 months, maybe as long as 2 years for the more complicated districts to form these. And there's a pretty big spectrum there. How many agencies are partnering together? How big is the area? All those sorts of things. There's a whole governance model that we can get into in Q&A if folks want to, but very importantly, I'll just make the point that you are setting up a new legal entity, a new separate legal Brown Act entity to implement these districts, separate from your city council or county board of supervisors. And there's sort of a governing document that guides the implementation, a so-called infrastructure financing plan. There are a series of public meetings and hearings to form these, but very importantly, there's not a vote. Okay, we're not increasing anyone's taxes, and primarily for that reason, we don't have a vote to form one of these or even to issue debt one of these. But there is a protest opportunity at the last public hearing, meaning like if more than half of the residents and property owners within the boundary did not like the concept or the specific financing plan or really anything about it, they have the opportunity to protest. And if more than half of those residents and property owners protest, you can't move forward. But essentially short of that, it can be approved to move forward and even issue debt in the future without going out to the vote. So nothing like a 2/3 vote or 55% vote. So if people don't like it, they have to come out and say no, but they're not required to come out and say yes with a vote. I want to cover some nuance. I do want to cover these climate resilience districts. Folks may already be hearing about these. So this is an alternative to the EIFDs. So what I just covered, everything I just talked about was the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. What I have on the slide right now is pretty new. It's the Climate Resilience District. Again, just available starting January of 23, a little over a year old. And it's very similar to EIFD in terms of how you form it. There's a governing document. There's a similar governing body. Some of the important nuances are that it's got some more flexibility in certain areas and some more restrictions in other areas. Some of the sources of greater flexibility is this is an entity that can not only fund capital facilities and maintenance, which EIFDs can fund, but these can also fund operations. And it's a detail, but it matters for some agencies more than others. So the other districts can fund the M in O&M, but not the O. These CRDs, these climate resilience districts, can fund both the O and the M, the operations and the maintenance for infrastructure that qualifies. So that's important for some agencies. Additionally, these CRDs, they don't only have tax increment authority. they do also have the authority to add a new tax, levy a new assessment. So they can essentially be both like an EIFD and a CFD, a community facilities district, under one umbrella. So they, just to drive the point home, they have both tax increment financing authority as well as special taxing authority. It's but just to be very clear, if one of these CRDs did want to do something like a special tax, then they would absolutely have to go through the whole Prop 218, 2/3 vote process if you are going to add that special tax. So CRDs can do either or both, tax increment or special tax. They have that flexibility. Okay, either, both of those are interesting. So there's no size limitations for these. Important, thanks Josh for asking. Just like for EIFDs, there's no size limitations in terms of acreage or assessed value, or you can make your whole city or county one of these if you wanted to, or you can make it as small as one parcel if you wanted to. Thanks for asking that. So those are the areas where it's more flexible. So you can fund O&M. You can add a special tax if you wanted to. There's a little bit more explicit authority to do things like administration. So these actually have the ability to hire staff if they needed to, which may make sense. Maybe after a few years when projects get going and there's more work to do, you can just have CRD employees on their own. That could be separate from city or county employees. That's a distinction for these. Where they're more limited, the part where they're more limited compared to the other tools are what the types of infrastructure you can fund. Hence the name Climate Resilience District. They are meant to be targeted toward climate resilience infrastructure. So examples listed in the law, things like improvements that address sea level rise, flood control infrastructure, improvements that address extreme heat or snowpack or wildfire prevention or drought. Okay, so these are just, there's a list of 4 things, and it starts with the words including but not limited to in the law, but this is the intent: climate resilient infrastructure. There's a question here on LAFCO's role as it relates to these, and it's not. These exist outside of the world of LAFCO. We're not creating any jurisdiction with new land use authority or expanding a city or county's or shrinking or changing anything about a city or county jurisdictional boundaries. So there's no LAFCO as part of these. Just some of the processes seem very similar to LAFCO, right? When we're talking about things like protests and public meetings and hearings. So I believe I covered some of these differences. I want to be cognizant of time here. So I really covered, there's areas of overlap for these, like speaking right now between the EIFDs and CRDs, which we think will be the ones that are most often implemented. Can both pay for lots of different types of infrastructure. They can both pay for climate resilient infrastructure here in the middle of these circles. To the right, I'll start first. The EIFDs also have the ability to fund non-climate resilience projects, right? EIFDs can also pay for affordable housing as one example, whereas CRDs can't really fund things like affordable housing because it's not necessarily climate resilient infrastructure. But on the other side, in the blue circle here, again, CRDs do have the ability to fund operations. They can hire staff if they want to. If they wanted to levy a special tax, it can do that. So there's overlap here. I should mention all these slides, by the way, we're making available to this whole group here. So if I can't cover everything in today's session, slides will be available to you through the EDF website. I want to be efficient with some time here. I've mentioned former RDAs. There's similarities and differences. Just to hit some high points here. Some of the differences were very intentional on the part of the legislature. You'll see a lot of emphasis on things like these public meetings and hearings and a ton of noticing, working on streamlining the noticing further. But that's really to distinguish from the formal RDAs that certain critics would say were not as transparent with their operations, and legitimately so. So some of the difference you'll see in this new world of tax increment is a much greater emphasis on noticing public hearings, making sure everyone knows what the plan is and being clear what the plan is. What are you going to do? What are you going to pay for? Over what time horizon? And bringing sort of the public along with that. Another difference is we don't have eminent domain like you used to have with RDAs. The one exception in the new world of tax increment is those CREAs that I mentioned that had a greater emphasis on affordable housing. They do actually have eminent domain authority for the first 12 years of their lifetime. They do have eminent domain authorities, but EIFDs and CRDs really don't have that at all. Again, trying to be efficient with time here. Feel free to review this material later. Just reinforcing the point on this slide that these are not meant to replace other tools that are available to jurisdictions. Things like CFDs will always make sense in certain circumstances. Things like lease revenue financing. If all you want to do is pay for a new police station, there are ways to more directly address certain types of projects. Oftentimes, these districts are a good tool when you want to set money aside, but you don't want to encumber any of today's resources because it's tax increment. You're not restricting any of today's dollars. You're restricting a portion of future dollars. There are pros and cons with that. The pros is you're not tying up any of today's dollars. If you're in a general fund budget crunch. One of the downsides of it is you don't have any money to spend day one. You can't go out and build some new park because you've just established your district, and the assessed value has to grow for you to have any tax increment dollars to spend. So we say it's not the fastest money. It's good money, it's helpful money, but it's not the fastest money. Some high-level comments here. Why we're seeing cities and counties in particular doing these. A lot of it is just return on investment. Most of the time we're doing these, we're focused on dollars and cents. Does it make sense for the general fund to do this? If we're going to encumber some portion of future, otherwise unrestricted general fund property tax dollars, it better make sense. There better be a return. So it's typically the case if we really believe we can incentivize some private sector investment that wouldn't otherwise happen at all, or as fast, or as intensely as it would if there was help with this tool, then why do it? You only do it if your general fund looks better if you do it than if you don't. That's kind of another way to put it. So return on investment, a lot of times I said we spend time and effort working on dollars and cents, but there are other measures of ROI that were often brought into the equation: job creation, housing production, in cases just infrastructure that needs to get solved, or deferred maintenance. This is just one tool among others that can do it. The less obvious one that we always want to point out is number 2 on this page. It's the ability to attract other money. It's the ability that, these dollars, even right when you form the district and before the dollars flow, you can be using these as matches, local matches for things like grants. And you'll see, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, as they roll out their pro-housing designation program, they're giving points to cities and counties that are doing these sorts of things explicitly. They call out EIFDs explicitly in ways to get, more points for pro-housing money. And there's a lot of money in pro-housing money. Your infill infrastructure grants, your affordable housing and sustainable community grants, TCC, transformative climate community. So it helps attract yet other money. A lot of action across the state. We can revisit more case studies perhaps after Scott's presentation if there's time and interest. We're at about 26 of these tax increment financing districts fully formed across the state. I agree with Josh. This is the one that the most northern that is fully formed in Humboldt that Scott will talk about. One in Mount Shasta is currently underway. That's the yellow one that may barely eke out Scott in terms of northernmostness, but they're also different. Again, we can talk about more of these if there's time and interest later, but seriously, Southern California, Northern California, coastal, inland, some of these are transit focused, some of these are affordable housing focused. Many of these are just core water and sewer and roadway focused. They vary highly. Some of these are cities going alone. Some of these are counties going alone in unincorporated jurisdiction. And now we're at about 6 of these that are city and county partnerships within incorporated jurisdictions, which are great. There's one in the Central Valley in San Joaquin County where you've got 3 cities in a county all partnering. So all shapes and sizes. Different ways to use the money. Many of these will issue debt, by the way. This is a vehicle to issue debt sort of off the balance sheet of the general fund. That's one of the positive features. If you do ask a finance director or CFO, you can issue debt with these without general fund credit pledged, without any assets of the city pledged. So there's upsides and downsides. You have to pay for that in terms of interest rate, but there's limited downside risk for the general fund credit. There's also ways you've seen these stacked one on top of each other, things like TIF and CFD layered on one another, where the CFD, Community Facilities District, perhaps a more familiar tool for this crowd, that can be used to access dollars sooner, or as a sort of a bridge until some of the tax increment funding starts flowing. So that's why we see some of these stacked from time to time. They can exist peacefully. TIF and Community Facilities District can actually work quite well and complementary. There's a question about whether it's limited to property taxes. Primarily, yes, we're talking about property tax. There are some of these other tools that come up sometimes in acronyms you may have heard, like Neighborhood Infill, Finance and Transit Improvements Act, the NIFTY Act, and if that wasn't enough, there's the NIFTY 2. I'm intentionally not spending a bunch of time on those. They do allow you to additionally allocate sales tax in addition to property tax. There are a bunch of strings that get attached to it that really make it infeasible. You got to put your whole city in the district if you're a city, or your whole county in the district if you're a county, just because that's the way sales tax is apportioned, as opposed to a parcel level like property tax. And that's just a no-go. Pretty much every city and county we've ever talked to. So short answer is yes, we are really just talking about property tax here. Covered this topic about the match for grants. It's a big reason. It's just not obvious. That's why we emphasize it so much. These are a good match, and it's a good way to match because you're not tying up today's dollars. You're just allocating a portion of future dollars. I talked about the 12 to 15 month timeline to form these. I won't go through this slide in great detail, but I would like you to know that it's there. So if you do review this later on your own time, some of the steps you'll kind of see laid out. You know, when do you have to go to city council or your county board, and then how does this other entity that you mentioned, this public financing authority, interact? So there's this, within this 12 to 15 month timeline, there's a good deal of public meetings and hearings, a good deal of noticing via mail, via newspaper, via website. It can seem daunting, you know, it absolutely can seem daunting. For that reason, we're working with organizations like CalEd and others to streamline this process further. But it's also navigable. Fortunately, there are folks who have done this, so there's templates for these things, and it can be done more easily. But this is the process. I do want to cover, before turning it over to Scott, just kind of some lessons learned. I want to make this, again, hopefully useful, hopefully relevant to folks here. Just some things that we've learned along the way, as many of these have now been done. You know, we do sometimes get approached by cities and counties that come to us at COSMA and saying, hey, this looks, I don't know, looks a lot like redevelopment agencies. That was generally a good thing for us. You know, let's go for this. And maybe we'll figure out later on what we actually want to pay for. We have no idea now, but we know we like the sound of this tool, and we'll figure things out later. Look, honestly, that's one way to go. If that's palatable to your staff, to your elected officials, you know, go for it. Happy to help you. Honestly, our advice, though, is where possible, focus your district, your whole business plan first on what actually needs to be funded. Are you focused on a specific, I don't know, water treatment plant? Is it a specific set of projects? It could be multiple, but a specific set of projects: roadway, water, sewer, transit, affordable housing. And then let's work backward from that. What's the nut we're trying to solve for? And then we can focus our district boundary, our percent revenue allocation, you know, when we go out to the market with a bond, we can work backward from that a lot easier if we know what we're trying to solve for. And it just works a lot better. Like if you're a city trying to approach a county to be your partner in one of these, if you're clear about what the end goal is, I know what I'm saying is intuitive, but you know, we've seen it roll out both ways. It works a lot better when there's focus. Second point, potential partners early and transparently. So if you're a city, certainly approaching a county for partnership, makes a lot of sense, probably intuitive. Include them early and transparently. Have some idea of what you're talking about, but don't have the cake fully baked, so that it's clear that input from that partner is relevant. Project champion at each level of government, especially an elected official. So if you have a mayor or council member at the city level or a supervisor at the county level who is willing to champion this thing to their peers, I mean, that's the way these things get done. Best, probably obvious, I know, but we've done it both ways. It's a lot harder if we don't have someone willing to step up and be a champion. Defensively analyze public agency and community return on investment. Use numbers, right? What's the ROI for the general fund on a net fiscal impact? How many jobs are we talking about? What are the wages associated with those jobs? How many units of housing? What's the affordability of those units? Make it clear that there's a positive ROI for doing this thing. Otherwise, why do it? A realistic but-for test, that means what happens if you do this versus what happens if you don't do it. That sells on every level, to your elected officials, to the community. make it clear that if you're going to tie up future dollars, that it's for good reason, that you can actually have the ability to catalyze something that wouldn't happen otherwise, or as fast, again, or as intensely. We find that it works best if we are aligned with something like a specific plan or a certain portion of a general plan that enables a land use intensity that really drives and facilitates assessed value growth. These tools work better if we're in areas of transit or blended use or just higher intensity residential development, because that's where the assessed value growth can happen. So we like to be very closely aligned by land use documentation. And complementary funding, can't emphasize enough. These tools don't solve everything on their own, and they work very well. In fact, they work best when layered with other tools, things like grants, things like community facilities district, definitely private sector partners. In some cases, some of these may never have to issue debt, because you may have a private sector partner who's actually willing to advance funding, and all they want is a guaranteed reimbursement mechanism, something better than a promise that when future people pay into an impact fee program, you'll pay them back from that. Private sector doesn't like that. There's no certainty there. Who's going to pay it? When are they going to pay it? How much? There's no certainty there. But something like this, where there's a very clear tie between the developer performing on their project, generating some new assessed property value, and getting a piece of that back through one of these districts, that's a waterfall they can follow. And that goes a long way compared to some of the other opportunities. So I'm going to pause there. Lots of case studies. I even have some kind of Q&A in here or some kind of polling questions, but I want to be sensitive for time. Happy to come back to that stuff. I'd love to just pause for a moment, see if there's any immediate questions I can help address. I'll start with Susan's comment here. Yeah. Anybody who's been successful using opportunity zone private sector investment, a lot of talk about it, right? Difficult to find investors. So we've seen some limited, I'd say limited. I mean, it's definitely a bigger deal made about these things than the reality of it. Central Valley and Fresno County, in Los Angeles County, in the San Pedro area, we have indeed seen some examples where, yeah, a project actually went forward that wouldn't have otherwise gone forward, or a project was significantly changed in a way that was more beneficial to the community than it would have otherwise been, because there was this federal capital gains tax relief through the Opportunity Zone program. So the answer is yes, we've seen some folks, but it has been, in my opinion, few and far between. You're just hearing one opinion. If others, on the Zoom here have opinions, it's always interesting to hear other perspectives. But that's what we've been seeing at Cosmont. Didn't live up to the hype, but it hasn't been zero. So obviously, go ahead, Josh.
Concurring in that opinion, I think there was a lot of interest, and I think in some of I know in San Jose, there's been some success stories. Oh, maybe in key, high value urban markets, but rural areas, not so much. But what one question I had what was about this, I think the climate resilience district, given all the climate challenges that the North Coast has faced and continues to face, I expect there'll be increasing interest in that. I did see was it Santa Cruz is pursuing something like
That's right.
combined EIFD. Yeah. So I'm aware of on the coastal Mendocino, for example, there's these series of small disconnected independent water districts. And during the last drought period, there was this, big scramble to end up water, from one inland part of the county out to these towns that, they're small towns, but they generate substantial tax, transient occupancy tax. And so there's been a lot of turning around, how could these, and I know the State Water Resources Board and everything is really interested in getting these infrastructures connected. I'm wondering if climate resilience district that kind of unified the geography would make it less sort of one-off competitive and more kind of a unified program. And I don't know if that's been explored. I'll certainly raise it with the people I know, but it seems like, would that be an appropriate use in your experience of the
I do.
CRD?
Yeah, I think so. Part of the whole reason of doing these is to get partners to sort of bring dollars to a project that would otherwise, not be available. The governance model is like the best exemplifier of that. The governance model meaning if you have, more than one public agency, more than one city or a bunch of cities in a county, or multiple counties even, that there's this governing board, this public financing authority, or for a CRD, it's a district board. It's the same thing, but the composition of that governing entity incorporates whoever's giving dollars, and so you're sort of being forced to bring these folks together to actually put together a business plan collaboratively. And whatever the allocations are of dollars, they absolutely still have to get approved by each independent, body. So each city council, each county board of supervisors does have to independently agree to whatever the commitment is. But then there is this hybrid entity that has everybody on it that's really in charge of running the day-to-day and implementing that business plan. So it is intended to serve that exact purpose.
And what is the downs, would private property owners be like, I'm against this, even though it might, give them access to a unified water system or something? I mean, would there be a reason for individual owners to go against?
No, the only reason, so it talked about the protest opportunity.
Yeah.
For, we've had massive districts like Palmdale is 26,000 acres. Eastern Coachella Valley, I think, is 90,000 acres, is for real. And, in Fresno, it's 4,000 acres, in downtown Fresno. Otherwise, we see like less than 5 protests and that many people. And the reason is you got to do your education right. First thing you have to say is it's not a new tax. As soon as you say it's not a new tax and you make that very clear, you are allaying a lot of the concern and the potential questions. You got to do your job on education. So where is the resistance then? Like, to the core of your question, Josh, the resistance is usually internal. It is, we're not encumbering any of today's dollars, but we are absolutely encumbering otherwise unencumbered general fund dollars. So it could be a tough decision for a city manager, finance director, or CEO, CFO at a county level to want to make that commitment. And it could be a similar position of sort of your fiscal hawks among elected officials. You are tying up future dollars. That's where the resistance is, but it's usually not at all from landowners.
Yeah, so if your choice is do something and survive, or do nothing and, continue to drag along the bottom, it seems like a pretty simple choice. Well, good. That's great. Really great presentation, Joe. Nice and succinct. Is there any other questions in the room for Joe before we would switch to Scott? And I think we'll have enough time at the end for follow-ups with Joe, as well as, his contact information is on the deck that we'll post and send around. So yeah, I'm not seeing any hands raised. We've got a nice throw. There's Layla. She's got something. All right, Layla.
Hey, thank you. I know we touched on this briefly earlier in your presentation, Joe, and by the way, thank you. It was probably a little too advanced for some and not advanced for others, but I think you found a lovely sweet spot. I'm grateful for this.
Oh, thank you.
Because I represent our region's community foundation, you can imagine one of the things that's in the back of my mind is what is a philanthropic partner's right role. And I wonder if you could just riff on that a little bit.
Yeah. It varies. Sometimes it's just advocacy, to be honest with you. Sometimes it's here's a need that our community needs, and the community have a number of different definitions, of course. And it helps that messages reach particularly elected officials, but also staff at a public agency to understand the need and to understand, there are tools out there that the local community may not be aware of. And, just because you were on a webinar or a call, you might be aware of. And so they could just be a matter of advocacy or sharing information that could mean a whole lot, even though maybe to some it doesn't sound like that's a lot. That's one way. I talked about, a way that we've seen it be quite substantial financially, and fewer and farther between. But those are cases where, yeah, there are developers or even institutions. We've seen even like metropolitan planning organizations or council of governments that have funding help with technical advisory to even sort of get this ball rolling. You know, if you're dealing with a community or set of communities that don't have a ton of technical expertise or even just financial resources to like study one of these things or to stand it up, we've seen agencies, again, like COGS or NPOs or other types of foundations just help out with bringing technical advisory or short-term funding or whatever, just to get the ball rolling. Organizations like SCAG and SoCal, we know that ABAG, MTC, East Bay, EDA in the Bay Area, doing things like this to actually fund short-term grants to get to sometimes just study, but also sometimes fully implement things like these tools. I mentioned case of developers that are willing to do things like advance infrastructure to be actual part of the financial plan, where, yeah, these districts are great. They set up and encumber future dollars, but again, they don't have dollars day one. But if we do have a private sector or even a nonprofit partner who is willing to advance funding for the infrastructure itself that is needed, but they would rather structure it as a loan instead of a grant of funds, that type of structure can work quite well, where they're advancing funding to be reimbursed through this mechanism. So advocacy, I'll call it sort of technical advice / education, and then financially, those are probably the three we've seen most.
Helpful, thank you.
Yeah, that was great. And, just because we do have a strong presence from tribes in the Redwood Coast region, I know that being sovereign nations, they aren't necessarily taking advantage of property tax. Have you seen in any of these others that you've been involved in any way that tribes have participated, or how might they think about this mechanism as a beneficial opportunity?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Josh, for raising that. I had in one of these case studies that I could bring in later if there's, again, time and interest. Though, in some of our work in the Riverside County area, specifically the Coachella Valley area, through that COG, the Coachella Valley Association of Governments, so there's a huge tribal presence. You covered it. There's no property tax that these organizations have to offer, but they're an incredibly important voice in the room, and they have played, in our experience, one of those key advocacy roles that I was just mentioning in response to Layla's question. So they were key at the table at the CVAG public meetings and hearings, opining on sort of what are the community benefits, what are the, it's great that you're going to sort of tie up these future dollars, you've got some ideas of specific things to pay for, but how does the larger community benefit? And especially at the county level, to have the tribes weighing in for county supervisor consideration, that was a huge part. So a huge advocacy role. Beyond that, although they're not able to contribute dollars, they can still be beneficiaries of the funding. So if there are improvements that, let's say, are on tribal land that do benefit, non-tribal jurisdictions, roadways that go over tribal lands but still benefit other jurisdictions, those are absolutely still eligible to be funding. Just because the tribe is not allocating property tax, they can still benefit from the improvements. So that's the way they interact. Not so much a sort of a giver into the financial process, but they could be beneficiaries as well as advocates. And they were in the Coachella Valley region.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, so great. Let's shift gears and hear a little bit more. This is a very local specific project that I know Joe and the Cosmont team were involved with, Scott and the folks at Humboldt putting together. It's this really cool existing EIFD out there that's going to help transform the infrastructure related to all the big futures being planned. And Scott can tell us all about it and his role there. So Scott, I think probably most people know you here, but I wouldn't hesitate to introduce yourself and talk about your, role in the whole process and what you're doing now related to that as well. So
Right.
thanks a lot, Scott.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Adair, and I am the Director of Economic Development for the County of Humboldt. I also wear the hat as the General Manager for the Samoa Peninsula Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District in Humboldt County. And I'll walk you through just a little bit about our EIFD in particular, and also its creation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I've just got a couple of things that I want to share with everyone. Everyone can see my screen, okay? Should see a big EIFD logo there on the screen.
Yeah, we can see it. You might want to, I don't know if you can expand, zoom in a little bit, maybe, or
It's a little small.
yeah, there you go. That's great. Yeah.
So let me give you a little bit of backstory here, which is the preface to the creation of our EIFD. This was just pre-COVID, and our community was having an ongoing discussion about all of the opportunity in our county, which seemed to have a great focus on and around a specific geographical area of Humboldt County, which is the Samoa Peninsula. And there were a number of projects that were being proposed and planned, both by our Port Authority, our Harbor District, and some private projects as well, which we anticipated through our research and analysis was going to require a great deal of infrastructure to complete, and was going to result in the creation of several hundred new jobs for the community, which would then put a demand on other infrastructure, soft and hard infrastructure, such as housing and childcare, et cetera, in the community. And so our Board of Supervisors, our elected officials, they formed a task force, and that task force comprised of county officials, department heads, our team, our economic development division was involved. We had our public works team involved. Our planning and building director was involved, but also other partners, academic partners. We were working with, at the time, Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt. We were working with California Center for Rural Policy and a number of other private sector partners to really assess what the best mechanism or vehicle would be, if you will, to help financially support all the infrastructure that would be needed to maintain and support these emerging industries and these new projects out on the Samoa Peninsula. And so we went through a process with that group of reaching out to property owners and doing some property engagement surveys and one-on-one interviews, and talking with our commercial and residential residents out in this particular area of the county to get a feel for how they, as constituents within this area, anticipated to be impacted by the development along the peninsula and along our port areas, and just what their priorities were as far as, enhancing the quality of life for them and for their businesses and their workers. And the result of those conversations and the property owner interviews and the one-on-one discussions that were had really pointed us to a direction that there had to be some sort of a mechanism created whereby there would be an investment of public dollars in the community to help sustain some of these improvements. And I keep referencing these improvements. And what are some of these improvements? Well, I'm sure most of you are already aware or have heard that Humboldt County is one of just 2 communities off the entire western United States coastline, which presently has approved and signed offshore wind development leases between offshore wind developers and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. There are other offshore wind development areas planned, but Humboldt County is one of the areas that has executed agreements between the developers and the federal government. And based on a number of actions that we're seeing from our federal and state partners, it looks like that those offshore wind projects are moving forward. The federal government came and Congressman Huffman came into town and announced a $400+ million grant to the Harbor District for port infrastructure development. And we have some other major projects happening aside from offshore wind on the peninsula. There's a large-scale recirculating aquaculture, indoor aquaculture facility, which has been in the pre-permitting process for a number of years and has finally cleared hurdles with the Coastal Commission. This area that encompasses the geographical area of our EIFD is also the landing point for Project Echo, which is the longest subsea fiber internet cable in the world. And so you can see that we just had a lot of activity and action happening in this area. And I think that we really had that going for us pre-creation of the EIFD. I know, talking with Joe and talking with others, that in some cases communities create these EIFDs, these other districts, these climate finance districts or others, to help spur development and to help sort of ignite activity in the area. In our case, it was the opposite. We had to figure out some way to support and serve all of the opportunity that was already occurring. So after that task force met with all those property owners and we determined that an EIFD was the best mechanism to put into effect, we talked with our partners at GoBiz, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, and they were very instrumental. They're our counterparts. They're to our economic development agency, the county level. And they were very instrumental in helping to guide us around some of the various tools that exist, and also talk about some of the challenges and opportunities around EIFDs. And it was through that period of time that we then connected with Cosmont as a subject matter expert in this arena. And we began working with Cosmont and the GoBiz team together, sort of a almost public-private partnership, Cosmont and the state and the county working together. And in 2022, the County of Humboldt established our first enhanced infrastructure financing district on the Samoa Peninsula. That district, it encompasses over 2,200 acres. I've got a picture of the geographical area of our EIFD on the screen here. And you can see that this is, I keep referring to it as the peninsula. If you're not familiar with Humboldt County, it is literally a peninsula that is just on the west side of Eureka, which is our county seat. And it surrounds and encompasses the Humboldt Bay, which is where some of the offshore wind activity will be occurring. I say that in 2022, we formed the EIFD. That makes it sound a lot easier than the actual process was. Our Board of Supervisors had to pass a resolution of intention to establish the Samoa Peninsula EIFD. After the resolution of intention, they passed a resolution directing staff to prepare the IFP. And then there was ultimately a resolution to approve the IFP, which is the infrastructure financing plan. And in between those the adoption of those resolutions were required public comment periods in which the public had an opportunity to come and weigh in on the formation of the EIFD. Our EIFD is created specifically to support infrastructure projects that create jobs and enhance quality of life. The EIFD facilitates improvement of public infrastructure, as Joe indicated, by leveraging property tax increment, which is generated within the EIFD area. It is not a new tax. It does not increase residents' property taxes. Instead, the EIFD captures the growth of property tax revenues that are occurring in the area. Our board was fairly generous in that when our EIFD was created, they allowed for 75% of the increase over the base year. The base year is sort of, you create this starting threshold. This is the starting point, and everything that we're talking about for the EIFD is beyond that starting point. So above that base year, the board allocated 75% of the increased revenue back into the EIFD, which can be leveraged for additional improvements. Our EIFD, and this is just some future assumptions that we made concerning build out, some anticipated build out over a 10-year period on the Samoa Peninsula. This actually would be, this is very light today because much of this work was done before we had the executed lease agreement for offshore wind. And you could see that even pre-offshore wind, we were anticipating all of this growth from housing to coastal industrial and commercial recreational, new square footage being added to the peninsula and increasing the value substantially in the long term, which is something that you really want to see if you're considering the creation of an EIFD. Some of these projects I mentioned earlier, which were sort of the impetus for forming our EIFD, the Nordic Aqua Farms land base, and it's not salmon anymore. They switched to yellowtail. Indoor recirculating aquaculture facility. It's completely enclosed. There have been housing growth on the peninsula, which is adding to the value, which is contributing to our EIFD. And then, of course, I mentioned offshore wind. Some community benefits were, community benefit assessment was completed for our EIFD to better understand what the impacts would be, not just the fiscal impacts to the county, but what some of the induced and indirect impacts would be. And we were able to determine that the EIFD used properly to promote economic prosperity and the achievement of the state's energy goals, creation of jobs, and quality of place for Humboldt County would help to obtain or help us to move toward regional benefits, including a $52 million net fiscal impact to the county as an organization on a present value basis over a 30-year period of time, that the EIFD would help to support 200 new housing units in the EIFD area, would help to support several thousands of direct and indirect induced temporary jobs over the lifetime of the EIFD, create over 800 permanent jobs in the county, and also help contribute toward almost $1 billion in new economic output for projects occurring in the EIFD for the county over the 30-year period. It's important to note that for our EIFD, a lot of work went into it. It took us years to form, quite frankly. putting together just from the very beginning the community outreach and engagement, assembling drafts of the IFP, going through and identifying your boundary, your legal description. You've got to get an engineer to sign off on all of those documents, and a lot of this is just part of the legislation that is built around the development and creation of EIFDs. The establishment of the resolutions. I mean, we were definitely, it was definitely a multi-year process, but what I find with EIFDs, and Joe might be able to weigh in a little bit more, you sort of run at the beginning so that you can walk. Now that the EIFD has been formed, because the way that the income, typically the revenues work for EIFDs, there's not a lot of money there in the beginning because you're waiting for revenue growth, property tax growth to occur. And it's sort of this hockey stick curve. And our first year of creation over the base year, I think our EIFD created under $1,000 in new value. And there's really not much that you can do with that, let alone support any staff time around the governance of it. What you have to do is use and either borrow against or bond for or leverage that income stream that is going to be created so that you can front load some of those improvements in advance and then use the EIFD to pay it back over time. Otherwise, you'll wait 10 years before you may be able to afford your first project. We have formed a public finance authority. I will share, just sort of as a landmine, a challenge for all of you to consider. Our county, even our county council and our legal support teams had a real hard time wrapping their head around the fact that 3 members of the primary legislative body who are member to the EIFD also sit on the Public Finance Authority board. And so we have 3 board supervisors who are also Public Finance Authority board members. And our council was really concerned about that as a potential Brown Act violation. We were able to overcome that hurdle. The California State Constitution does allow for elected officials to serve in these dual capacities under the right circumstances, and the EIFD is one of those. And but it is something that is hard, I think, for jurisdictions to sort of wrap their head around. We are certainly happy to talk with any community individually who may be looking to form an EIFD, just about lessons learned and best practices. It's certainly not something you can really adequately convey in a 20-minute presentation. There's really a lot to it. Our EIFD, we really haven't done much since formation except commit to a number of studies and analyses to help our Public Finance Authority better understand what types of infrastructure improvements to fund. Right now, our EIFD has worked in partnership with our Harbor District to engage with a local engineering firm, Moffitt Nickel, to perform a highest and best use analysis of the developable land that is within the EIFD area. And then when we go back to the approved infrastructure projects, which are in our infrastructure finance plan, and I've got that on the screen here, you can see that we're quite broad in the types of projects that we can and will fund. But our Public Financing Authority really wanted to understand the sequencing of projects, what needs to come first in order to support the development that's already occurring there, and where can we get the most bang for our buck. And that assessment is still ongoing, and we're hoping to have that completed and have further direction from our Public Finance Authority by the end of the year. Um, we get being a coastal community, we get a lot of questions about sea level rise, and was it wise or prudent to form an EIFD just adjacent to coastal property, which may be inundated with tidal waters. This may not be really relevant or pertinent to some of you who are not coastal communities, but we did have to go through very thorough examination with NOAA of the area to better understand how sea level rise might affect the EIFD boundaries. And that's something that, depending on your EIFD and where you may be forming it, there may be something not in legislation which is required for you to do, but just because of your own very specific dynamics pertinent to your own community, like if you're a coastal community, you might have to perform some other studies or analysis before formation of your EIFD. And that's really my presentation. So thank you for the opportunity to share today. And I know it was a mouthful, but Josh, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I mean, let's say every time I hear about, like, I've been in several informative talks by on EIFDs. First, you get your acronyms right, and that's always a bit of an effort. But really, I pick up something every time. So it's I think both of these together really were a great picture on what's possible, and it's great to see. I put it in the chat, but a key message that I've seen and appreciate from my work in the Monterey and the Fort Ord 30-year program is that that's the kind of thinking that it's long-term, long lead work, this economic development, especially infrastructure related, and to have to go through what unless you had that long-term view, to go through all of the and work to get to where you are wouldn't make sense. But once you do, I've seen these work, and by the this one's at the early stage. In Fort Ord we had some where I came in at the end in the last, and they had amassed value and were really yielding money that was going directly into projects. So I think it's super important, and especially in the context of this Redwood region rise and generally the California jobs first. I know there's an impulse to say, well, let's figure out, a quick fix. And I think this is a real encouragement to have that strategic long-term view and set things up right for a longer term benefit. So I see Craig put a question for you in the chat there about the Coastal Commission.
Thanks, Craig. No, the Coastal Commission did not have to weigh in on or approve creation of the EIFD. They were part of the process. And my guess would be, and maybe Joe knows, that's because they already have approval authority over the actual development and infrastructure projects that are going to be occurring within the coastal zone anyway. So we can form the EIFD and fund whatever we want to. But the Coastal Commission's role isn't as concerned about funding as they are the actual developments. And so they had no role in our EIFD. I don't know, Joe, have you seen them involved in any other coastal EIFDs?
No. There's been a talk of involving them. There's this whole there's two sections of the government code that potentially get triggered when you start talking about paying specifically for port or harbor infrastructure. Sonoma Peninsula has avoided it, and then one that we're working on, the San Pedro community in the city of Los Angeles, is avoiding it. But there are potential entanglements. If you've got major port or harbor infrastructure that you're thinking about paying for within this district, you do potentially have to involve harbor agency as a governing entity. And then if you issue debt in the future, you actually might need state lands approval. It's for those reasons that many times, like in Humboldt County, we're like strategically trying to carve out what we're paying for, just being very clear about sort of not stepping on port and harbor toes explicitly. Otherwise, you do start having to go that direction, Craig. So it's a somewhat technical matter for discussion, but something to be aware of. Ways to avoid it, but also ways to get involved if you have to.
How about the infrastructure and investment plan? Like, how rigid are those? I mean, do you, you can set out a set of targets long term, and what leeway is there to modify them?
I can start, and Scott could probably weigh in. So a lot of leeway. Short answer. What could you possibly know now for the next 50 years that's going to be 100% accurate, right? I mean, these are 50-year-long districts. So they're intended to be flexible. When you first prepare these plans, you've got 3 boxes you essentially have to check as it pertains to what you're going to pay for. It's timing, cost, and location. So you saw Scott's example. He had sort of brackets, sort of near term, midterm, long term. He didn't have to say exactly 2031 or 2033. There's no requirement. You have to say something about time. You got to say something about location. Is it within this quadrant of the area? Is it throughout the entire area? Is it a specific parcel? You've got to say something about it. And then cost. Great if you know it's exactly $4.25 million. That's less of the time for us. Mostly we're talking about ranges like Scott's. Somewhere between $5 and $10 million we're going to spend on these sets of improvements. This other category, maybe 15 to 20 million. And that's all our projections at the time of formation. Very importantly, these are plans that are required to be revisited annually. And so many of these will be revised from time to time, if not annually, maybe every couple of years, as you just get better information. World changes. So projections might change, targeted projects or the prioritization of those projects may change. And that's exactly the intention.
And a lot of that is going to be influenced by the elected body, which is responsible to approve the IFP, depending on the atmosphere in your community, the political atmosphere, and the needs around infrastructure and what may be happening in terms of opportunity or challenges in your community. You might end up with an elected body that wants to be very specific about what's in that IFP, or you may have an elected body that wants to be broad. And as Joe indicated, whether you start out specific or broad, it can also be amended in the future. Our IFP, we left it very open-ended, and even used language in our IFP, like such as, not limited to, because we wanted to be able to define that as we moved forward.
Yeah, well, that's helpful. I know that we're getting close to our end here. I'm just gonna kind of send us off with one other thought before I'll pass it to Susan, who also has a question there for you. But we're starting to think about the project list, throughout this Redwood Coast region, and it'd be interesting to think about all these projects, individual projects, in the context of some kind of district that could help, kind of lump them and then do the funding. I mean, that to me is so maybe a way to think about, if we could identify key project sets that align. Part of the California Jobs First funding could be, towards the studies and the work around the formation of the district as a foundational move. I mean, just a thought. So we'll have more time to debate all that, I'm sure. But Susan,
and that was kind of what I was thinking of when I was thinking, can there be too many? I mean, so you have the infrastructure down on the peninsula, but we also have like the climate resiliency stuff in the county. Is that the county because the way I'm kind of understanding is ultimately this cuts into the county's profits, right? Because
Mhm.
instead of taxing somebody, you're taking it out of there. Is
Yeah.
there a capacity where the county's like, I don't want to talk about another thing like this?
I mean, it's hard having a budget deficit.
Right.
But that's why we continue to sell the message of it's about growth. It's really about, okay, county, you are going to, rather than taking $100 from this activity, you're going to take $50 and invest $50 back into the activity so that we can grow that activity, so that next year you're getting $200 and the year after that you're getting $300. So like, we try to model it as this is about investing back into those projects which are creating new revenue, county. And that was the most, I think, convincing argument when we talked to our, I mean, we had to get a lot of people to weigh in, not just our elected officials, but department heads, our auditor controller, our treasurer tax collector. I mean, if any one of them wanted to kill it, they could have really made it difficult. But when everyone saw it as an investment with a return, it changed the thinking on it. So maybe, yeah, maybe, or maybe Susan would figure out a way, if there's like a tool like this, how do we maybe modify it a little bit to add something to it rather than creating something new? Because there has been a little bit more resistance lately to like, not another new thing.
Yeah.
Well, and also because just I'm thinking about in terms of things like climate resistance, that's more of a county, we've got HCOG, I think,
Right.
doing some work with it, but they're not really the county. The cities
Right.
do, but then you'd have to get all the cities together. So any of those options.
Yeah. So you definitely got the answer that's most relevant to you, Susan, from Scott. For folks in other counties or folks just interested in other counties, if we're doing our job right and structuring it as Scott said, with a positive ROI, if you're doing that, then it would support the argument of you can't have too many if you're actually making more money, but it has to be defensible. We do have in Los Angeles County 5 of them where the county is participating. You have in the county of Madera 3. You have in county of Riverside another 3. You have in the county of Sacramento 1 that the county is a part of, 2 that they're not, in cities that they're not a part of. And so it's really less about, is there just sort of too much total exposure? It's really more about, do each one individually make sense? And if they each have this positive ROI, let's keep doing those. Let's not do ones with negative ROI. That's what we're kind of seeing statewide. But we do get the question exactly as you stated, from like a county CFO type or city finance director type. Do I want to be so overly exposed in this area of tax increment? It's a legitimate question. It's just an input to how we frame the districts. Let's craft it so that it can be viewed as a positive and not just as an encumbrance.
Excellent. Well, this has really, I think, lived up to my hopes for what we would be able to get into and cover. I think even though we've lost a number of folks, everyone who's left has left enthusiastically. And I know that even some have been chatting me on the side saying how widely they're going to share the information with their network. So
Good.
yeah, really appreciate you guys making the time to do this. And like I said, we will be getting this up on the website in the next couple of days. We'll share out the slides and put them on the website. And thank you, Abigail, for putting in the next sessions that we're going to have May 1st on tribal considerations. Ross, I see you still here. Thanks for stepping up to be part of that. And then new market tax credits on June 5th. So I think assuming these continue to go well, we'll look to also continue these into our phase 2 work. And it's enriching we have upcoming the Cal Ed conference in Santa Rosa in a week or so, and I'm going to make some comments. One of the comments I am planning to make is that economic development, though it's not really taught as a subject in college directly, I've come to realize and appreciate that it's actually a profession. There are specific, bodies of knowledge and expertise that are employed in doing the work, and this is an example of that. So, I think it's really helpful, especially as we kind of get into this phase of the planning for California Jobs First, where we're really trying to kind of narrow the funnel down on what projects make sense for this, regional prosperity over the long term. So, with that, unless there's any other comments from the group, thank you all
No.
for hanging in there. Susan, you have anything?
No, I think this was really useful for some people, and other people will be like, this isn't what I do. But that's why we're putting together a group of folks, right? So some have expertise in all the different things.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye,
for having
everybody.
us.